Hello everyone, Rob Ruthoff here, excited to go into the second course in the Theological series. This is on the Bible, or interesting little acronym, Basic Instructions Before Leaving Earth, which I think is really fun. This whole track is around this idea of a logical way of approaching theology. So theology being the study of nature of God and religious belief, really kind of our existence, and logical being in a way that is, clear, sound reasoning. So a theological is a logical discussion of the existence and our purpose. And in this, there's going to be a number of different parts to this. We're going to ultimately introduce the Bible, cover its historical importance and accuracy, an overview with what to expect and how to understand really how to read the Bible. We'll talk about the various different books and versions of the Bible, kind of dive into the symmetry and the patterns that we find, as well as talk through the canonical, the apocryphal, and the pseudeographical. So even what those words mean. All right. So let's first start with the introduction to the Bible. I think it's, its purpose, as we'll start understanding, is really just through and through to help us understand the plan that God has for us and the work that God is doing for us. But we're going to dive into that more. For now, let's just look at the Bible as an instruction manual for us to understand what's going on in all this chaos and what our mission is. It also is a love story that shows really the love that God has for his people, even when we rebel against him. And so the question typically becomes, well, I don't know, is the Bible just like, what's the difference between the Bible and the Quran, or, things like this? And I think for what we have with the Bible that no other book can say is that it's historically accurate, right? It has predicted future events. We can also prove that Jesus was a historical figure, and we can even show that those who have tried to preserve the Bible have been attacked. And so that's ultimately where we want to kind of touch on, is how do we prove these pieces out? And I think I can't, share my faith with you. I can't, share my beliefs in a way that you'll understand the way that I understand in a visceral way. But what I do believe is that if we want to figure out, is the Bible even legitimate? Like, is there anything to this? Is we first need to start off with kind of just laying a foundation for, is it probable that there's something interesting going on with the Bible? And, is it a historically accurate document to start with? So the first point I want to throw out there is just that the Bible is by far the most circulated book in the history of the world. According to Guinness Book of World Records, there have been between 5 and 7 billion copies sold. Okay, so that in itself means nothing, but as we start layering in all of these pieces, we start seeing that it's more probable than not that the Bible is actually what it says to be. To put this in perspective, the next closest book is the Little Red Book by quotations from Mao Zedong, who is around 800 million copies, and then the Quran at about another 800 million copies. Don Quixote, which is a fiction, is like 500 million copies. And then you have, down the line, you have like Lord of the Rings and other things like this. So ultimately, all I'm saying is the closest religious book being the Quran, and also the Quran, is about a third, Islam is about a third of the population of the world in terms of religion, roughly. So, the fact that the Bible has been circulated not, close to that number. I mean, we're talking, over 5 billion times. And the most closest is 800 million, is a pretty big deal, right? So I'm just saying that it stands out a little bit that says, okay, that's significant. What I think is most interesting is not just that it's been circulated so much, but the continuity of it. The Bible has 66 books written over a 1,500-year period of time with 40 different authors, and yet its message is incredibly consistent and clear. If you were in my last class on theism, as we look at some of these other books, they don't have, none of them stand up to the Bible in terms of consistency as well as in terms of historical accuracy. So when we look at the Bible itself, it's broken up into the Tanakh, which is the Old Testament, as Christians would understand it. And that was written around 1800 BC to 400 BC. And then the New Testament, which is written around 40 to 70 AD, roughly in that period of time. So what's interesting with that is that it's, the first part of the Bible is actually taken from the Jews, and then the second part is the gospel taken from when Jesus came to earth forward. I do think it's interesting, just as we're kind of talking about dates, that it's a little bit interesting that our entire way of counting time is based on before Christ and after Christ, right? So before Christ, BC, we've seen, BC, everyone's seen that kind of, it's been changed now to BCE, which is before Common Era, as a way for atheists to move away from, distance themselves from Jesus. But every book will tell you that it started off as BC, before Christ. And then we have the Latin phrase Anno Domini, which translates the year of our Lord. So that's 80. Now that's been changed to CE, which is Common Era. So again, a way to distance themselves from Jesus. But it's pretty interesting that even if they change the labels, it's still based on really the time period of Jesus, and then the time period after Jesus came into the world. So pretty interesting. Hard to, one more little piece adding to the list. Again, like I mentioned, ultimately the Christian Bible is a combination of what we refer to as the Old Testament and the Jewish Bible of the Tanakh, as well as the New Testament. The two of these together form the Bible. The Bible of the Jews included three parts: the Torah, also called the Pentateuch, which was the first 5 Bible books written by Moses in the Bible, and then Nevi'im, which was the books of the prophets, split between the former and the latter prophets, and the Ketuvim, which was the writings. And these are split between the Emet, or the Hebrew for truth, and the 5 Megillot scrolls that were read during feasts. So ultimately, the way we get that they get the term Tanakh is really the initials T, N, and K put together. So the Old Testament combined with the New Testament, and the New Testament is formed around the Gospels. So that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the people that knew Jesus. Then the Acts of the Apostles, the letters to Paul and the Romans, and Corinthians and all the different churches. Then the letters of Paul to Timothy and Titus and Philemon, and then ultimately the letters to Hebrews. James, Peter, John, and Jude had some letters that they wrote, and then the Revelation according to John, given to John. So that's just a real kind of brief understanding of what the Bible is all about. And now let's move into the historical importance and accuracy of the Bible. Now, we would assume that over the last almost 2 centuries, that the historical accuracy of the Bible would either be validated or disproved. And what we found is it's actually quite validated. So answering the question, can we prove the historical accuracy of the Bible? With the archaeological discoveries that are formed, the answer is yes. Now, this doesn't prove that the Bible comes from God. In this instance, this just proves that that the names and the places actually are historically accurate. Okay, now we'll prove more in a little bit, but just to lay the foundation that once we've found the Dead Sea Scrolls, right, it demonstrated, and I'm going to quote here, demonstrated the unusual accuracy of the transmission over a 1,000-year period, rendering reasonable to believe that the current Old Testament texts are reliable copies of the original works. So the Dead Sea Scrolls proved that the Old Testament was ultimately had not been changed over a really long period of time. Meaning that when they discovered these old texts, they compared them with the modern Bible, and they found that they all checked out. That the modern Old Testament was exactly a copy of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's pretty interesting. Now, there's other findings. The Rosetta Stone, which was discovered in 1799, 1 year after the fall of the Papal Empire, interesting, or actually would have been 11, I guess. These Napoleon scientists essentially identified that it was unique that it contained 3 languages with the same text. So what this means is that when they found this, right, it unlocked these names and these dates that otherwise weren't confirmed in any other kind of history. So when the Rosetta Stone was discovered and the dates were discovered and the places were discovered, etc., and the names, I should say, is it confirmed the authenticity of the Bible. What it contained was essentially the same announcement written in Egyptian, then again in their cursive format, the Egyptian Demotic, and then in Greek. And this allowed translators to kind of really use the known Greek to unlock the language of the hieroglyphics. And inside of it, it stated a decree celebrating the anniversary coronation of the king of Egypt. But more than that, unlocked the names that, like I mentioned, that weren't previously ever used other than what was found in the Bible. And some people were saying, well, the Bible's fictitious because of these, names of kings that don't appear anywhere, right? But this stone unlocked the necessary proof to prove the legitimacy of the Bible. And it's not just one. We've seen this in inscriptions found in a large rock cave on a cliff in Iran that was crucial to decipher cuneiform script, and it included the same text written in Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. So again, essentially, this is to cuneiform what the Rosetta Stone was to the Egyptian hieroglyphics. And what is important about this is that it once again contained names which are also found in the Bible that were thought lost in time. So that's a second example. Yet another one is in the Moabite stone, and in this stele there was which is dated around 840 BC, and then discovered around 1868, and it confirmed the biblical accounts of the Moabite attacks on Israel that we can read in 2 Kings chapter 1 and chapter 3. So again, more dates, more evidence, and this is all coming out just in the last couple hundred years, proving that's been earthed, been buried and only been unearthed in the last couple hundred years, proving that these dates and these accounts of wars and events, which otherwise historians didn't have access to previously, are all verified. The Cyrus cylinder, yet one more. This one was discovered 1879, and it confirmed the biblical account of Cyrus and his deliverance of Israel from Babylonian captivity. Right? Again, another confirmation of the Bible. Until 1993, the name David, the personal name David, had never appeared in the archaeological record, let alone any reference to King David. And that led some scholars to doubt, the existence of David, which is a key player, King David in the Bible. However, in 1993, that Tel Dan stele was discovered, and it corroborates the passages from the Bible, such as the historical accuracy of the Israelite kings, such as David, Ahab, and Jehoram. So again, more. This was only found, within a generation ago, and this one again corroborates more passages from the Bible. And we could literally go on for days with this. We just continue to unearth new archaeological discoveries, all of them which are confirming the Bible. Now, there's a couple of videos I love. I recommend you take a look at that dive deeper into the Rosetta Stone, into different inscriptions in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Ultimately, those who've questioned the Bible because a name or a place was otherwise undiscovered, been eating their words when in the new inscription is found, right? That corroborates the Bible, and it has said for ultimately, shows that it is a historically accurate document. Again, other names would be King Assyrian, Sargon II, et cetera, et cetera. So to kind of take a recap of this one last little time here, the renowned archaeologist Professor Albright was quoted in the mid-1900s saying, "In the center of history stands the Bible, and thanks to archaeology, we can now recognize its substantial historical accuracy. We can treat the Bible from beginning to end as an authentic document of historical accuracy." And again, this is, we've seen this, there's literally nobody in the scientific community that's an archaeologist that is going to say that the Bible is not historically accurate in terms of the kings and the time periods. Now, there are some nuances where you could say, well, some archaeologists think that the dates don't align for some of the kings of like some of the pharaohs, but what they don't realize is that some of the pharaohs actually had co-regents, and so the Bible is the only really true record that shows about co-regency and actually creates a timeline that is legitimate. Otherwise, if you don't realize there's people that are sharing the throne at the same time, it blows their timelines completely out. And so again, without the Bible giving us that foundation, the interpretation of man has been faulty. So without a question, the Bible is historically accurate. Now, the question then becomes, as we move into this, can it predict future events? Is it more, is it something, greater than a historically accurate document? And we'll prove on that next. So in addition to proving that it's historically accurate, I want to just throw one more point out there. It's actually scientifically accurate. And this is interesting. The Bible, even before modern science understood what evaporation and condensation was, the Bible spelled out how the waters and the sea were poured out on the face of the earth. In Amos 5:8, it says that it really talks about the whole water cycle. Right now, we plainly understand this now, that rain comes from the water, right? It's evaporated out of the sea, comes up and condenses into the mountains, comes down as rain, right? But before, really in the last, in the modern times now, we didn't understand these basic geologies. But when we actually looked at even the Bible, thousands of years has told us this this detail. There's a quote by William Herschel, who was a German-born astronomer and composer, that wrote, "All human discoveries seem to be made only for the purpose of confirming more strongly the truths that come from on high and contained in the sacred writings." So pretty strong statement, pretty interesting. What we find is that the Bible does not conflict with any sort of natural phenomenon, and in fact, it even explains these. So more than that, let's look at something that is maybe with, a little more convincing even, right? And so, yes, historically accurate document, check. But is it inspired by God, right? And so now let's look at, the only way to assume this would be to figure out if there are predictions that were provided in the Bible that ultimately came true. And the Bible tells us that God can declare the end from the beginning, but what evidence do we have of this? And so just to set the ground rules, for me, in order for this to be, legitimate, right, it obviously has to be made prior to the event, and it has to be exact and not like super vague, right? Like I don't want to go to like some, tarot card reader, right? I want to see a real prophecy needs to be specific and exact, right? And not vague. So let's take a few places. Let's start with Egypt. In Jeremiah 46:2, we read that there's a biblical account that depicts exactly what was going to happen to Egypt. Again, this is historically accurate, right? But let's get into a prediction. And here we read against Egypt, there was going to be, in the 4th year of Joachim, the Josiah king of Judah, this is all just historical, right? No big deal. But it then says, "I will cause their images to cease out of Noph, and there will be no more a prince in the land of Egypt." So this is 600 BC, and Ezekiel was instructed to record a prophecy of God regarding the city of Noph in Egypt, and that their images will cease and there will be no longer a prince in the land. Also at the same time period, in 600 BC, Jeremiah was given a similar prophecy that Noph will be desolate and without inhabitant, right? So these are statements, and so if we find out that that this is not true, then let's just throw the Bible out, right? Let's just treat it as a historically accurate document that has no greater context, no greater meaning. So where is Noph? And Noph is the Hebrew word for what is modern day Egyptian city of Memphis. Okay, so let's look at Memphis. Memphis was the ancient capital of Lower Egypt, major metropolis, right? Memphis was believed to be under the protection of the god Ptah, right? The patron of craftsmen. And clearly this god doesn't exist because today the ruins of the former capital often fragmented evidence of its past, just as was predicted, right? So many cities have been rebuilt, but the ones that God says will not be rebuilt never are. And here's an example of what Memphis looks like today. right? There's a few tourists walking through it, but it is not rebuilt, and it never has been rebuilt. But that's just one, okay? Pretty compelling, but we need more. Next example is Babylon. At Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans, and excellency shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It shall never be inhabited, neither it shall be dwelled in from the generation to generation. Okay, so that's a pretty strong statement. Babylon will never be inhabited again. And this is what modern day Babylon looks like. In fact, there's this guy, Drew Binsky, who's kind of finding annoying lately, but really like his original early on travel videos. He did a tour of Babylon and showed that it is completely deserted today. More on this, you can actually YouTube Babylon and prophecy and learn a lot more about this. But again, second example, Babylon, completely desolate today. Let's do one more example. Nineveh. So in the Bible, it says that Zephaniah 2, verse 13 to 15, God will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and will make Nineveh a desolation, a dry like a wilderness, and flocks shall lie down in the midst of her, and ultimately Nineveh was prophesied to be reduced to a pasture. Okay, so did this come true? If we look in Google Maps where Nineveh used to be, although it's completely surrounded by the modern city of Mosul in modern-day Iraq, it is uninhabited, right? So we can see this map. We can see how there are people everywhere around this area. But when we zoom in, it's desolate, completely surrounded by the city of Mosul, and all there is some cattle that are grazing there. So again, that one is a very strong one for me of, there's no reason that this has not been rebuilt on, and yet completely desolate as God predicted in the Bible. Another example, Persia. Now, with this one here, I actually just recommend Googling Persia and Bible prophecy. They spell it out really interestingly, but again, same exact thing. Next up is Tyre. And with Tyre, again, Isaiah 23:15 says, Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, and history tells us that Nebuchadnezzar took mainland Tyre in 572 BC. Within a few months, according to the first century Israeli historian Josephus, Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Tyre for 13 years, right? And this was predicted, and it says, I will now, this was stated by Josephus, right? So this was, again, the current site is now a place where the fishermen still frequent and spread their nets to dry. And what we read is that, and they shall destroy the city walls of Tyre and break down her towers. I will scrape her dust from her, right? And it even says here that it shall be a place for spreading of nets, right? So Alexander the Great, this whole idea of make the top of her a rock and the spreading the nets, it's all been predicted. And Alexander the Great built a causeway with stones in the mainland city of Tyre and left it like a flat rock in 332 BC. So here's modern day Tyre today, and you can kind of see that that peninsula that's sticking out. That's the causeway, right? We can kind of do an overlay, and we can see how there was never, it was just a little island, right? And Alexander kept building into the sea and built the causeway as a way to then finally go in and take Tyre. So interesting. Again, there's a book called Fulfilled Bible Prophecies That Prove the Bible, and by George Davis. Recommend this. And he points out that Syrian fishermen hauling their nets and called this place just as Bible predicted. So more on this. There's a video called The Lost City in the Sea. Recommend. Last thing with Tyre, and there's so many more events in this, but Ezekiel actually predicted more events than just that all came true. So the list keeps going on and on and on, and the Bible has predicted accurately what city would be no more. Now, later in this series, we're going to get into really the heavy hitting stuff, right? And so the course is called Bible Prophecy. And in the Bible Prophecy course, we're going to get into a really convincing, and I have a whole presentation just on this, so we're going to check that out in a little bit. But it talks about really showing the predictions of Daniel 2, 7, and 8, and how before Medo-Persia, before Greece, before Rome ever existed, the Bible predicted in very stunning ways exactly who the next kingdoms in time would be. And this one to me is incredibly convincing. And so I recommend you take this course, watch the course I have on Bible prophecy, read about Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, and really those predictions that played out and showed us, these very specific date time frames that predicted some pretty interesting things. I also have a book called a course called The Hidden Book. We'll see if that one plays out. There's an interesting story, but we'll see. Like I said, I don't know how this one's going to play out yet. It hasn't happened yet, but it's pretty convincing. Okay, so John 14:29 says that God has told us before it would pass that we would believe when it comes to pass. And so I do believe that God has been, very generous with the proof, the evidence that he's put out there. If we want to believe, there's plenty of evidence to believe. There's one more, and this one's kind of interesting. To me, especially if you were to look at the course on Bible prophecy that I have and Daniel and Revelation, it is super abundantly clear to me that the Bible is, without a doubt, a historical record and can be used to predict future events. So let's talk about Jesus now. Obviously, the central character of the Bible is Jesus. And so can we prove that Jesus existed as a historical figure? Not that he's the Son of God or anything like that. Just can we prove without any question that he was a historically accurate figure? He lived, right? Let's see if we can prove that. Okay? So outside of the Bible, let's not use the Bible. Is there any historical record of encounters with Jesus? Is Jesus historically accurate? Now, the most famous Roman historian really provided interesting insight that's independent account of the life and crucifixion of Jesus. So we read that, the most widely regarded, the greatest Roman historian, right, has his works are a chief source providing significant and independent extra-biblical narrative of the life and crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. And in his book, Tacitus wrote that Christ suffered extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So Rome's greatest historian says that Jesus existed and was put to death by Rome. Right? And again, this is not this is a secular source. This is just history. Okay. Interesting. There's even a Pilate stone that was discovered, and so when we read in the New Testament about the crucifixion of Christ, right, undisputed fact. But what's interesting is that although Tacitus and Josephus mentioned Pontius Pilate, there wasn't any actual archaeological evidence until 1961. Discovery in the Mediterranean seaside around the ruins of Caesarea that unearthed a Latin inscription of limestone named the Pilate Stone, which reads, "To the divine Augusti Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated this, essentially this stone." So again, interesting that even the name of the individual that tried Jesus, we have historical accuracy, historical confirmation of him as well. Again, Josephus, not a Christian, wrote about Jesus. And let's read his quote. "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one call him a man, for he was one who performed deeds, surprising deeds, and was a teacher of such a people to accept the truth gladly. He went over many Israels and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ, and when upon accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life." So he's actually saying that Jesus was resurrected. "For the prophets of God had foretold these things for 1,000, and others marveled about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared." So again, this is like a pretty powerful thing, right? This is an Israeli historian, okay? And he mentions Jesus in 3 different books, okay? So there's no reason for, he wasn't a follower of Christ, right? But he wrote very compelling statements that Jesus not only died, but also resurrected. Pretty powerful. Let's go further. A Stoic philosopher, Marabar Sepperton, wrote a letter to his son where he actually refers to Jesus of Nazareth. And he writes, "What advantage did the Israelites gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished." And he's talking about 70 AD when the Romans completely sacked Jerusalem. God justly avenged these 3 wise men. Athenians died of hunger, the Samaritans were overwhelmed by the sea, and Israel, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, lived in complete dispersion. He goes on to essentially call Jesus the King of the Jews, which was the inscription above the cross. So again, this is one more account, from someone that has no reason to lie, right? He's a Roman philosopher, right? Now, Greek historian. Okay, so we've touched on Israelite, we've touched on Roman, now we're going to talk about Greek. Here's a Greek historian, Thalos, and the author of the History of the World, which is considered as like one of the most important, confirming the historicity of Jesus and providing a non-Christian validation of the gospel accounts. He refers to the darkness at the time of the crucifixion of Christ. So not only does Thalos mention that Jesus was crucified, well, 1, that Jesus existed, 2, that Jesus was crucified, but he also shares that the world was dark. Let's read his quote. "On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down." So again, this is not only an account that Jesus existed, this is an account that Jesus was crucified, and it's an account that Jesus was crucified, and the whole world, as they know it, was in darkness and a major earthquake. Okay. Next, Greek writer Phlegon, which I can't pronounce, mentioned Jesus and even the events again at his crucifixion. He refers to the description of as an eclipse accompanied by earthquakes during the reign of Tiberius. Right? He says that even stars appeared in the heavens. It was so dark. There are tons of these, right? These are not restricted to just a few people. The point is that if you do the research in non-Christian sources, you will find without a shadow of a doubt that Jesus existed. And more than just historians, if we go to the people that would ultimately did not want Jesus to exist, right? These would be really the Jews who, ultimately had sacrificed, had crucified their Messiah, right? Once they realize this, there's no way they would want to share this. And yet, in the Talmud, there are many passages that reference Jesus. Now, granted, he's referenced as a sorcerer, right? He's referenced as healing. He's referenced as a teacher, a disciple that turned out badly, as a frivolous disciple who practiced magic and turned to idolatry. Jesus is identified as punished in the afterlife, so he was also identified as being executed, and is identified being the son of Mary. So these are all negative things, right? He is ultimately identified as a rebel, upsetting the tradition of the Jews. But if he wasn't doing miraculous things, then why would he be called a sorcerer? Why would they say that he's healing people, right? Why would he say that he's practicing magic? Look, these don't sound great from this perspective, but from a Christian perspective, but they actually really validate the fact that Christ existed, right? Christ existed, and the Talmud even says that Christ worked miracles. And these are people that don't want to admit that Christ is God. And so they call him a rebel, they call him a sorcerer, versus saying that he's a healer, versus saying that he's a miracle worker, I should say. Right? So again, really convincing if you have the enemy of Jesus saying that he was executed, right? Confirming that, saying that he was healing and a sorcerer and a magician, that means that Jesus was doing things that were supernatural. So not only is he a historically accurate figure, he's also a supernatural figure. And the rabbis taught that, Jesus had 5 disciples, right? Matthew, Luke, Andrew, John, Thaddeus, the ones that they had identified here. So again, historically accurate. More than that, again, they mentioned that he practiced magic and deceived Israel and led Israel astray. So to that whole gospel is for the Gentiles and the Jews, right? That's how it all came about. Again, this to me is some of the most compelling when the Jews say that he was practicing magic, right? When the Jews say that he was healing people. Super convincing for me. And then we have like some other things. I mean, like ultimately Jesus is, he was, named Time Magazine. Not that means anything, but it's really the idea that Jesus is identified as the single most powerful figure in all of human history. Okay, so when we based our time around him, right? And so when we put all this together, right, there's no question from any historian that Jesus was real, a real figure. Now you can say, they may say, well, he wasn't God. Okay, sure. But you can't deny that he existed. He really existed. And the Jews refer to him as a sorcerer, as a magician, right? And the Romans refer to him as a rebel. So Jesus is historically accurate, proven. And let that sink in, that ultimately Jesus is the most impactful person of all time, and the Bible is the most popular book of all time, right? When we add those things together, that's a pretty, I guess, for me, a pretty interesting combination, a pretty solid path to say that, there may be something to this. And this alone, this alone is just a way to start building a little faith to say, I'm going to test Jesus for myself. I'm going to actually read the Bible. And before I read it, I'm going to pray, God, if you exist, send your spirit, be with me as I read your words, and help me to feel your presence, and help me to understand what the message that you have for me. And when you pray this and believe, right, earnestly believe, just take what you've learned so far and say, okay, I don't know if you exist, God, but the Bible is historically accurate, and Jesus is historically accurate, and it sounds like Jesus even worked miracles. So, Lord, I want to take a leap of faith and believe that you are real. And God, I just ask that you show yourself to me, and it's not going to be what you think, right? Like God's not going to come out and all of a sudden the sky open up and he says, hi, right? But if you are really listening and really want to believe, God will show himself to you. And for me, it was when I did this, it was simple as a breeze. It was a very, very still day. And I asked that God show himself to me, and I felt a breeze that was otherwise no wind the entire day. And the breeze came, and I just felt chills when the breeze came to me, and that was enough. And I said, okay, God, you exist. Look, that's silly to some people, but the point is simply, I will never be able to prove to you that God exists, but I promise you that if you want God to exist and you are looking towards him, looking for him, and you actually open up his Bible and ask him to reveal himself to you, and sometimes it doesn't happen the first time, sometimes it happens the second or the third time, or whatever it takes, be persistent. You'll know, and you'll know what I know. And that's really the most exciting thing I could ever share with you. Because since then, I've experienced some really powerful things. And the more faith I have, and the more I put myself, the more I surrender myself to God, the more powerful I feel him. And it's a level of peace that I can't even share. Knowing that the all-powerful Creator God has got my back. And, those that know me have known that, I've done okay, and I'll tell you, everything that, God has been very generous to me, and it's only after surrendering to him. And the times that I'm really working hard, it's just chaos. The times that I'm really trying to do things on my own, it's chaos. But when I really surrender and I say, okay, God, whatever your plan is, And now this isn't some sort of prosperity gospel in the sense that if you follow God, God's going to make you rich. But what I will tell you is God will make you happy. And you will have a peace that passes all understanding. And all it takes is just a little faith in saying, okay, God, like, I'm open to trying this out. And knowing that there's a lot of distractions, and sometimes, we start a conversation and walk away before God has time to answer. And so I just ask that if you do, put yourself out there and be vulnerable and have faith, that you don't walk away before he has a time to respond to you. And I'm excited. Like, if you ever start to feel what I feel, reach out to me. I'd love to talk more about you, about this with you. So with that, the next section in this is going to be understanding the Bible, and we'll break this out in a second video. But again, I'm super excited to be on this journey with you here in the second course in the Theological series, and really looking forward to the next module where we dive in deeper and understand really how to understand the Bible, how to read the Bible, and etc. So with that, I just ask that God blesses you and that you really give God a chance to speak to you. Talk soon.